Very much. Okay, again, Joe Thomas. I serve as the Class of 1961 Chair and Professor of Leadership Education at the Naval Academy. I co-authored the piece for the upcoming book with a former colleague of mine that I actually still work with quite a bit, named Shannon French. And many of you know Shannon. She participated in one of the earlier versions of this, I understand. Shannon is the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. Shannon and I work together at the Academy on issues that are pretty closely related to this. Her interests, she's a philosopher, of course, and her interests overlapped mine in many ways, so we've been teaming up on a variety of projects since then. Most recently on the nature of post-traumatic stress disorder, as it often is called now, combat operational stress, which is kind of a subcategory of PTSD. So with your permission, and thanks to Laurie and Dan for the invite to this, I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount. It is ironic, I guess, because a place like a service academy, there is literally a daily conversation about honor. In fact, in my own department, mine is the Leadership, Ethics, and Law Department. It's kind of a strange combination, interdisciplinary department by its nature, made up of folks who specialize in leadership, industrial organizational psychologists, clinical psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, lawyers, all living under one roof. It makes for interesting discussions that don't always lead to dueling, but it's come close, I got to say, a couple times. Yeah. So we all approach ourselves, this issue of honor, from really, really different perspectives. But I have to say I've gained a lot just in today's conversation and last night's dinner, because all of you look at things so completely differently from even the conversation, this complex conversation that we're having in Annapolis, or even among our sister service academies at West Point, the Air Force Academy, Coast Guard Academy, and the like. So I really appreciate it. It's with that in mind that, with your permission, I'm going to audible a little bit. I'm actually going to set aside the paper. I'll give a quick overview of the principal questions that we ask and the method that we go about answering the two primary questions. But I'd like to give maximum time, actually, to Q&A, again, with your permission, because I'm really interested in hearing at least some alternative perspectives on what I consider the two critical questions regarding honor for the U.S. military today, particularly. We're at a kind of a strange pivot point in the military in 2015. But more important than that, kind of where we take these things in the future. Because in addition to teaching at the Academy, I also stay fairly connected to the larger professional military education structure, the war colleges. I teach on behalf of NATO's Partnership for Peace program, which are the former Soviet republics and former Warsaw Pact states, on matters of civil-military relations and things like that, to compare notes as to how we make progress in non-technical ways. Right? So there's a whole different side of the Partnership for Peace program that focuses on the technical issues of our being able to work seamlessly with the Georgians, as an example, or Kazakhs, or the Poles. But the folks that I tend to travel with in those places look at kind of soft skills and philosophical matters, or at least political matters, to ensure that we're kind of really speaking from the same sheet, I guess is the point to that. So, with this issue of honor, and the thing that interested both Shannon and I has to do with this dual interpretation of honor that exists in the military today. One interpretation of honor, one way of approaching the issue of honor, is as a standard of integrity. And as Laurie mentioned, there's an honor court here as well, that's student-run. We all have the same thing. I imagine many of your universities are the same way. The matter of a standard of integrity, that definition, for us is not problematic because it's very legalistic by nature. Right? Standard of integrity typically drives honor codes or honor concepts. In our case, a midshipman will not lie, cheat, or steal. In West Point, It's a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do, non-toleration clause, as it's called. But they're all really, really similar. And they're all governed more or less by black-letter law. So in that way, they're kind of a microcosm of how the military generally, the U.S. Department of Defense across the board, approaches honor when it's interpreted as a standard of integrity. If there's any growth industry in the U.S. military over the course of the past 30 years, the growth industry, without question, has been in JAGs, Judge Advocate Generals. Some will claim that this has been a positive thing. There are many, 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 and I may fall into this camp, who say it's come with a considerable cost as well. Right? This idea that you can apply this legal standard to things that in some ways inherently defy this legalistic approach. So that's one definition, and we'll set that aside. In fact, we set that aside in our proposed chapter as well because, again, it's not problematic today, and we don't envision it as being problematic moving into the future. The other aspect of or definition of honor in the current U.S. military, and the one we see as problematic moving forward, is a definition of honor as an implicit code of moral restraint. And the word implicit was very, very specifically chosen. Implicit in that it's all those things that exist in the gap between the same legalistic approach, because the JAGs, by the way, don't only concern themselves with matters of integrity, of lying, cheating, and stealing. There's a uniform code of military justice that dictates very, very specific punishments, rules, laws, and such that all military members are, of course, subject to. And then on the other side of that guidance of daily life, there's a very legalistic approach as to the constraints placed on military members, service members, when actually engaged in war fighting. And the examples of that are many. I'm sure you've heard stories, whether it be from recent wars in Iraq or current in Afghanistan or going back to Kosovo, where no single target, even when struck by piloted aircraft, hasn't actually been scrubbed by a JAG first before they prosecute those targets, right? To ensure that that it meets the standards of the established rules of engagement or escalation of force doctrine that's been laid out for that particular operation. But as a couple of us were talking about over lunch, the gray area, the gap that exists between these established rules and all possibilities in an extremely ambiguous environment, right? A chaotic, volatile environment, as does currently exist in the 21st century, right? Where asymmetry characterizes the modern battlefield, right? There's very few conventional fights going on, and there are very few that are predicted for our future, unless you subscribe to this notion that someday we will face the Chinese and this World War III type conventional war, which I think those who study these things say the possibility of that is pretty limited. And that's a good thing for all of us. But the continuance of this non-state actor threat to American interests, to Western interests, you could say, this constant state of insurgency in countries that don't seem to contain any U.S. interest, but we seem to have ourselves drawn into these things. The predictions from everybody, and you don't have to be a political scientist or a specialist in international relations to kind of believe that truly will be the state of affairs for an awfully long time to come. So what does that mean to the notion of honor among folks in the U.S. military today and tomorrow? Well, we're interested, the question kind of boils down in two ways. And one is, how does the traditional concept of honor guide the daily moral life of the U.S. military? How is it part of the conversation? Now, I will tell you, at a service academy, I mentioned before, it's part of the daily conversation because it's a 4-year undergraduate education that, oh, by the way, we hire all of our graduates. upon graduation, and we put them directly into leadership positions, and at least over the course of the past 10 plus years, directly into the fight. It's assumed that unless they go to graduate school before they get out to the operating forces or the fleet, they will go directly into the fight. So they are absolutely interested in sorting out these matters of the expectations that not just the institution, the military, has of their conduct, but they are certainly critically interested in what society's expectations are of them. So the nature of the conversations take on a much broader tone than I think many on the outside would expect, right? The expectation would be that, well, how do I stay out of trouble? And I don't want to dismiss that as part of the conversation as well, because it is a big part of it. So, and that's where I'll pick up the second portion of it, and if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I'll tell a story about something that I observed and witnessed in a past job that I think plays into this, and I'll give you an example, kind of an anecdote that'll illustrate this point nicely. So in the 2006-07 timeframe, I was asked to very comfortably settled in at the Naval Academy, had retired from 24 years in uniform as a Marine. I was asked by the Marine Corps if I would be interested in coming back to Marine Corps University. A lot of people don't know that exists. It's Marine Corps University is in Quantico, Virginia. It essentially is an umbrella for Command and Staff College, the War College, things like that, graduate level education for mid-career and senior officers. Right? So they'll get a master's in military studies or something like that in a one-year sabbatical, you could say, before they rotate back out to the operating forces as captains or majors or lieutenant colonels and colonels, depending on what level of professional military education. So the reason in the 2006 timeframe that the Marine Corps was interested in standing up a leadership institute came as a bit of a surprise to me. I assumed that they were reaching out to me because my background was in leader development specifically. My research has been in leader development for quite a while. And after all, it was called the John A. Lejeune Leadership Institute, named for this kind of iconic general officer in the just post-World War I time frame, who was, you could consider the warrior philosopher of the Marine Corps, reshaped the way the service approached leadership itself. Right? So I, of course, it's a pretty strong calling to be called back by your tribe, and since it is my tribe, I said yes, but that I'd probably only do it for a couple of years, and I did stick to that. Went back to Quantico and realized very, very quickly that it wasn't really leadership in the traditional sense that they were interested in, but it was rather the things that were troubling the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time that they were most interested in, and it wasn't failures of leadership in a tactical sense. Soldiers, Marines, and such weren't losing tactically on the ground. In some ways, it was a mirror of an earlier experience in Vietnam. I'm sure you've heard that same argument made, at least in some circles, about Vietnam. In fact, tactically, we were doing quite well, right? Especially at the point at which the surge happened in Iraq and afterwards. The real issue, the real thing that troubled society generally about the performance of the U.S. military then, and certainly the people within the military, were the major failings were essentially moral failings. So if you think back to that time frame, you think of the scandal at Abu Ghraib, right? The very infamous prison where soldiers abused prisoners in a variety of ways. You heard sometimes it was explained away as harmless pranks and things like that. It was the reaction, at least by some in the military, as explaining this away as this was non-lethal humiliation tactics meant to elicit information. And if we, in fact, accepted some things we shouldn't have, it was all in the interest of good outcomes, is the way it kind of went, right? And that disturbed a lot of people. It was a reaction as much as the moral failing and the discredit, the dishonor that it brought on the military generally. And Abu Ghraib is just one of them. The Marine Corps had its own. There was an incident in Haditha where Marines kind of overstepped restraint, normal restraint expected of combatants, warfighters on the field. And these things began to spiral a bit out of control. The media picked, justifiably, and I would say thankfully, the American media picked that up and ran with it. And it forced kind of an inward look on the part of the military, which became my role in life. So it wasn't about, again, leader development in a traditional sense. It became suddenly about addressing this issue of honor, quite honestly, and re-energizing the notion of honor in the rank and file. That's what it kind of boiled down to. So here's the anecdote that I said I'd use. So picture this, a big part of the role now, and I had there, just like our current Leadership Ethics and Law Department, JAGs involved in this process, which were part of the Institute, so lawyers, and folks involved, educational specialists, post-command officers oftentimes involved in the education process from entry level, so boot camp, all the way up through the War College, and working on curriculum meant to infuse all of this back into the system. As well as chaplains and everybody else that had some kind of interest in it, psychologists and so on. And so there I was, going out to these bases around the country and having conversations with groups, sometimes of 300, 400, or 500 Marines gathered in base theaters, for example, in the final stages of their pre-deployment workups. And the most challenging part for some of this relative to this issue of honor is many at this stage had already done 1, 2, or 3, sometimes more tours in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. My own sons were in that same situation. They were deploying to Iraq into combat at the same time. So it had a very personal, aside from the fact that I'm a retired Marine myself, it had a very personal dimension to it for me. And one of the most common questions that was thrown in the direction of this somewhat abstract discussion about honor was, well, that's all well and good, but I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Right? Have you heard that before? It's pretty universal in the military, in all services, and what it means is I'd rather go to a court-martial and be judged by 12 peers at a court-martial than to be carried by 6 pallbearers to my grave. So when I make a decision in combat, I'm going to err on the side of not just self-preservation. That's a part of what's at work, especially for 18 to 22-year-olds, where most of the Marine Corps resides. But it was really about protecting one's fire team members, squad mates. Right? It's about protecting the person to your left and to your right. That's a much stronger dynamic. And the more the elite the organization within the military, the more strong that dynamic actually is. For the same reason that if there is hazing, and there's been a great attempt to stamp out hazing across the Department of Defense for many years, it's oftentimes the most elite units that are most susceptible to hazing behaviors, right? Because it's somehow a privilege to be part of that unit. Therefore, you have to kind of go through these rites of passage and so on. Well, the same thing applies to the moral decision-making exercised by elite units. So my counter to that had traditionally been, well, this is not exclusively about the high ground, the moral high ground in all this. This is really about the tactical high ground. So I took on a very pragmatic argument, saying that every time you kill a non-combatant or a post-combatant on the field, you are in fact recruiting 5 more. So I think it's a fairly easy argument to understand. It's one that many young Marines kind of grasped instinctively, intuitively, but an equal number of them rejected that idea, that that's well and good, but right now it's about my life. There's several other arguments that could be made, but a far more effective approach that I found in this discussion was to kind of return to some of these, I think many people outside the military might view as antiquated or even anachronistic arguments that you will dishonor yourself. You will, in fact, when not exercising restraint, discrimination, and proportionality, those are the 3 pillars of jus in bello, for those familiar with just war theory, right? Conduct in war. And as three pillars, they guide the moral life of warfighters. My argument was you just are less of you're less of what the Marine Corps, at least in this case, holds up as the ideal or even acceptable version of a warrior. And they kind of got that. They kind of got that they would be letting down themselves. They'd be letting down the larger institution. And in an odd way, a way outsiders have trouble grasping, they're letting down, and this sounds kind of corny, but they're letting down Marines who died on the beaches of Iwo Jima in this case. That they felt kind of breaking faith with those Marines who had sacrificed and conducted themselves honorably, that they were kind of letting others down on a historical level, right? on a much, much deeper level than just the immediate concern. And that tended to resonate with most. And then there's others that other approaches were required in all this. But we are talking about really abstract concepts that have to be brought into really practical terms is where we go. Now, where Shannon and I have, I think, made some progress, and certainly our proposed chapter in all this, is by taking a look at a cross-section of various warrior cultures across history. So like many of you have covered the Greeks and the Romans, and since many of you are philosophers, there are certain philosophies, though I wouldn't want to have we have midshipmen reading Kant, and that's bad enough. Cadets read Kant at West Point, but it's not something, obviously, you're going to give to a Marine Lance Corporal. Not that they couldn't grasp it, but they just don't have time. They might take it really the wrong way. But what we do, though, is we incorporate elements, the ideas, the underpinnings of a variety of philosophies, both in the Western tradition, and believe it or not, there are a lot of non-Western traditions that really resonate well. And I will only speak to the Marine Corps side of things, because it's been my experience. But the example that we brought up last night at dinner was Stoicism, right? And a couple people were actually taken aback that Stoicism resonates the way it does in the contemporary U.S. military. And I would argue, well, it shouldn't. It shouldn't shock you. If you think of the work of Cicero, certainly if you think of the work of Epictetus, I think it's in many ways absolutely tailor-made for the type of hardships that young soldiers, young Marines, and such experience on a day-to-day basis. The fact that there is so much that's beyond their control. Epictetus, after all, as all of you know, is a slave who was treated very badly by his master, had his leg broken, and all this, and kind of that's the wellspring from which his philosophy comes. Right? It's a philosophy born in suffering. And there's something that resonates really closely to a young Lance Corporal whose life looks a lot more like Epictetus's than it does, think of some other author or philosopher whose philosophy maybe isn't born of the same wellspring, right? So that's easy to grasp. That works quite well. I think there's been a lot of conversation about Aristotle today. I think there's a natural appeal in virtue ethics. I think the pursuit of the mean. I think habituation resonates extremely well with young soldiers and young Marines because they get it. That's what daily life looks like in the operating forces. It's certainly what daily life looks like in the training pipeline. So that works well. There's certain, I mean, we talked about Kant and deontology. I mean, there's certain aspects of duty that certainly resonate. I don't know that I'd want to include too many conversations about the categorical imperative and such, although we do that with midshipmen. That's not usable generally, but there's aspects that I think resonate well there. And certainly utilitarian theory, that works well at the strategic level and perhaps not at the micro level that I'm referring to with some of these folks. So again, the paper goes over how we leverage some of these philosophies across time, but I'm really interested in, maybe if not now, if we don't have the time now, went awfully fast, then certainly as this conversation continues on, and now that I know about the blog that Dan has kind of started up and feeds, I'm very, very much interested in hearing how your perspectives can maybe be used for our purposes of the education of midshipmen and force at large. So, thanks.
Thank you. I guess what I'm thinking is maybe we could go ahead and let you go ahead and do your presentation, and then we'll have